It's my pleasure to introduce our morning plenary speaker. Dr. Charlie French's focus is public engagement in local decision-making around a range of issues, including land use, economic development, watershed planning, and civic agriculture. Much of his work centers on science and practice, ensuring the needs and input of decision-makers and the public are included in scientific inquiry. He is an Extension Associate Professor of Community Development with the University of New Hampshire, Cooperative Extension. As Coordinator of Extension's Communities Development Program, Dr. French brings his experience into the classroom as a faculty member in the Department of Natural Resources, where he teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in community development. He has a BA in Geography from Dartmouth College, an MA in Regional Planning from Western Illinois University, and a PhD in Natural Resources Policy from the University of New Hampshire. He is also an active board member with the Sustainable Harvest International, whose mission is to address the tropical deforestation crisis in Central America by providing farmers with sustainable alternatives to slash and burn agriculture. Please join with me in welcoming Dr. French. Good Canadian welcome for our American partner here this morning.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. It's an honor and it's a pleasure to be here. Gosh, I feel like I'm in my classroom. My students always sit in the back, so we have this huge empty space. So come on up here, folks. Throughout the presentation, I invite you all to get a little closer. I have to admit here, this is actually my first keynote presentation that I've ever given in my life, so I'm a little bit nervous. I do a lot of public speaking, but this is my first keynote. So if it doesn't go so well, I live a long ways away, and I'm from another country, so I wouldn't worry about it. Now, you've probably noticed that I don't have an accent, so I'm clearly not from Canada, but I do hail from the great state of Maine. How many of you have been to the state of Maine? Anybody been to New England, but perhaps not to Maine? It's good that you've been there. If you have been there, you've probably noticed that Mainers have a very strong, thick accent. It's a very colorful accent, and when I'm with friends, perhaps over a pint of beer, sometimes my accent slips out, and it might actually slip out in this presentation today. When I say lobster, I say lobster, and when someone asks me for directions to somewhere, I usually tell them, you can't get there from here. So those are all Mainisms. But I'd like to tell you a little bit of background about myself and about the geography of New Hampshire, just to provide a little bit of context to my presentation today. As Jason mentioned, I work at the University of New Hampshire, and I have actually 3 roles at the University of New Hampshire, which makes life a little bit difficult. The primary role that I perform is I coordinate an outreach program for community and economic development, which means that I go and I provide technical support and facilitation, and I work with communities around the state of New Hampshire. New Hampshire is a very small state, so you can drive from one part of the state to another in about 3 hours, so it's not too much of a geography to cover. So I coordinate an outreach program. That's the first part. I'm also a faculty member in the Department of Natural Resources, which is in our College of Life Sciences and Agriculture department. And so I teach environmental planning for both graduate students and undergraduate students. And the third part of my role is I'm essentially a research professor as well, which means essentially that I have to bring in a portion of my salary so I can pay myself. Which is becoming increasingly important as we've seen budget cuts in the United States. I don't know if you've paid attention to the news, to what's happening in Congress, but there have been quite a few cuts, and many of those cuts have come to education. So, now to give you a little bit of background about New Hampshire, for those of you who have not been to New Hampshire, it's a relatively small state, as I mentioned before, but it's essentially, I like to think of it as sort of 2 states within one. The southern part of the state, where I live, is very suburban. It's only an hour from Boston. So we have a fairly high population. The vast majority of the population of our state is concentrated in this southern portion. We do have some agricultural land and some forest, but it's fairly highly developed, and we have a beautiful seacoast. Most of our employment, they work in the Boston metropolitan area. They work in the high-tech industry and the medical industry. So we're largely an out-commuting portion of the state. But then there's the northern part of the state, which is anything north of where I live. It's very forested. It's a very rural part of the state. It's a resource-based industry. Until recently, we had a thriving forestry industry. But due to competition from the Canadians and from Brazil and from China, our forest industry has really declined over the last 10 years. And we've lost thousands and thousands of jobs in the forest industry in the northern part of the state. So whereas the southern part of the state is growing rapidly, the northern part of the state is actually declining. We have this brain drain of population. There's a youth outmigration. So we face our challenges in the state of New Hampshire, and part of my role is to work with the rural communities to help them to address some of those challenges. So now you have a picture of what New Hampshire is like. For my presentation, bringing the university to the community, my primary focus is going to be on public institutions. It's my strong conviction that public institutions really should be geared towards addressing the public good. It should be in our mission to work with rural communities to help them to thrive and to help them find the new economic future. But I also want to point out that though I come from a university, I also want to, and I'm going to be discussing the importance that, I'm not sure what you call them here, but community colleges are what we call them in the United States, technical institutes or trade schools. They play an incredibly important role in the state of New Hampshire, as I actually have learned that they do play an important role here as well. So I want to focus on that as well. Now, I want to start the presentation with a quotation. And this quotation is from an educator by the name of Ernest Boyer. I don't know if any of you have heard of him, but for me this quotation is very profound. The aim of education is not only to generate new knowledge, but to channel that knowledge to humane ends. Not merely to study government, but to help shape a citizenry that can promote the public good. Now, this sentiment largely resonates with my own feelings about what a public institution, such as the University of New Hampshire, should be about. Now, to give you a little bit of background about Ernest Boyer, he was an educator. He taught both primary and secondary school, as well as post-secondary education. He was the Secretary of Education under President Nixon. He was head of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Education, and he was also a chancellor at the State University of New York. And his lifelong fight was to really make education more dynamic, more engaging, and more focused on the public good. He felt very strongly that public institutions, as well as private institutions, should be focusing outwardly on the communities that surround them. He wrote a recent book. Actually, I should say that it's not a recent book. It's 25 years old. But I recently read this book. I like to pick up old books sometimes. But this book was called Scholarship Reconsidered. And in this book, he really articulated 4 types of engaged scholarships that institutions really should be focusing on. And those are discovery, the scholarship of discovery, the scholarship of integration, the scholarship of application, and the scholarship of teaching. When we think about what most institutions of higher education, particularly universities, focus on, it's that discovery, trying to find that new breakthrough. But he wanted to emphasize that it's not just about discovery. It's about application. It's about taking the knowledge from the universities and bringing it out to benefit the public good. And it's also about teaching, and not just the students who are in the classroom, but the public at large. So I very strongly resonate with Boyer's thinking. And it's interesting, he wrote this book 25 years ago, but I think those statements that he has made still hold true today. I'm going to switch microphones here, so bear with me for 1 second. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to talk about the evolution of the engaged institution in the United States. I have a feeling that it may have some similarities and some parallels to the evolution of the engaged institution here in Alberta, but I'm sure that there are also some differences. But I find it very instructive to talk about it. I'm excited to talk about the UNH experience. Much of my presentation today, I'm not going to be teaching you new tools or talking about new technologies. I'm going to be talking about the New Hampshire experience And the hope is that out of this, we can elicit some discussion. I'm going to reserve some time at the end of this presentation so that we can have a discussion about what's working here, what's different about our two situations, our two environments. And my hope is that we can build a long-lasting relationship. I look forward to actually staying connected with you folks in the future. And I'm going to be talking about some specific cases of how we've tried to emphasize different types of engaged scholarship in New Hampshire. And lastly, I want to talk about the lessons learned. I always like to say that I've probably learned more things by doing things the wrong way than I have by doing things the right way. I've failed a lot in my life. I'm starting to get my stride and starting to learn how to do things right, but I sure have a whole pile of things that I've done incorrectly, and I've learned from those experiences. So, the engaged institution. As I mentioned, I think it's perhaps not so different here how it's evolved in Canada and in Alberta. But I sat with a teacher on the plane yesterday as I was flying in, and she was giving me a little bit of an overview about the Canadian system. In Canada, it strikes me that you have a lot more public support for your institutions than we do in the United States. Our institutions are a lot more pricey to attend if you want to go on to college. But I think that there are a lot of similarities as well. And I think we can draw some of these linkages as we discuss this today. So I want to start out by talking about how the engaged institution evolved in the United States. So shortly after the formation of the United States in the late 1700s, public education was really something that was only accessible to the elite class. It was not something that the average citizen could participate or gain access to. And I think this was considered by many to be a problem. And the only way that if you were from a poor family could go on to public education was to join a mission and dedicate your life to that mission. But by and large, most people didn't have the opportunity to go to college. And there was a representative in the U.S. House of Representatives who strongly felt that institutions of higher ed have to be made more accessible to the public if the nation is to grow economically. So his name was Jesse Morrill, and he sat down with Abraham Lincoln, and they conceived of this model of what they called the land-grant university. And they passed a bill called the Morrill Act, and this Morrill Act essentially established a series of institutions around the country, and the primary focus of this institution was to build the skills of the public in some of the things that would help to grow the economy, in agriculture, in forestry, in fisheries, in industry, in the trades. And as it's called a land grant, it also came with a grant of land that came to these institutions. And so these proliferated around the country. And in fact, today we have over 50 land grant institutions in the United States. Every state in the Union has a land grant institution, which is really focused on the public good. And we have a land-grant institution in Guam as well as Puerto Rico. And some states actually have a couple of land-grant institutions. So this was a really profound moment in the history of the engaged institution where these institutions were specifically set up to provide access to education. So fast forward about 25 years, another significant act was passed in the U.S. Congress, and that was called the Hatch Act. And essentially, what the Hatch Act did was to create a series of ag experiment stations in each of the land-grant institutions. And these ag experiment stations were really about increasing agricultural productivity and increasing the resource-based capacity of the country to grow economically. And so a series of ag experiment stations proliferated. And as we think about some of the technologies, I noticed as I was flying in, you have a whole lot of agriculture. I'm assuming you grow a lot of wheat and you have cattle here. Many of the technologies that are used in agriculture today got their roots from these ag experiment stations that began over 100 years ago. They also still exist today. And in my own institution at the University of New Hampshire, we are doing a lot of work on what we call no-till farming to try and minimize the impacting of the land as you practice agriculture. So that was a very significant act in our history. Now fast forward again, another 30 years or so, and another act that was very significant in the United States was the Smith-Lever Act. And the Smith-Lever Act essentially created an institution called cooperative extension. Now, I'm just curious to find out, how many of you are familiar with cooperative extension or have heard of cooperative extension? So it sounds like very few of you have. Cooperative extension was specifically set up to serve as the outreach arm of the land-grant institutions. So whereas the land-grant university itself brings people to the campus to educate them and provide access to education, the mission of cooperative extension is essentially to take the research and the knowledge and the information that's generated on campus and bring it out to communities. And so every state in the union has a cooperative extension service, and that's the service that I provide most of my work with. Just to give you a picture of what cooperative extension looks like, each state has a number of counties. In my state of New Hampshire, we have 10 counties. In each of the 10 counties, there are educators. We call them extension agents, whose focus is to work with communities. We have educators that work in agriculture. We have educators that work in forestry, in wildlife, in natural resource protection. And they spend their time going out to communities, working with them, teaching, training, and capacity building. And so it's a very vibrant system. However, in recent days, we've had a couple of things happen that might impact the status of cooperative extension in the United States as well as individual states. Congress has reduced funding for education for the land-grant system, which will no doubt has already impacted cooperative extension services. My own service has seen a pretty dramatic decline. And then in my own state of New Hampshire, we get a fair portion of our funding from the state. The state voted last week, the House of Representatives voted to cut funding for the University of New Hampshire by 50%. So I don't know what our institution will look like when our state funding is cut by 50%. But I brought my resume along just in case, so I'd love to talk with you after. So we're in a transition period. We have to become more relevant today, and we have to emphasize the public value of what it is that we do for communities, not just the benefits to those that directly utilize our services, but we have to make the case to the politicians and those that don't use our service that we have value to the state. So fast forward again another 100 years, and we'll look a little bit at what today's engaged institution looks like. Well, I can speak for New Hampshire. Agriculture is certainly not as predominant as it was 100 years ago. In New Hampshire, we farm rocks. We're rock farmers. It's pretty difficult to grow anything in New Hampshire, so it's not a surprise that agriculture is not exactly thriving. So our School of Agriculture and Life Sciences is actually dwindling in size. It's actually shrunk. We have less people interested in agriculture and forestry, and more people moving to technology, to medicine, and to some of those into business. So we see a transition in what the engaged institution is working for. And we also see that whereas in the past we saw a lot of partnerships with communities in the public sector, we now see the University of New Hampshire is making strong partnerships with the private sector. We have a lot of activities that are aimed at commercialization of technologies, of medical technologies and engineering. And the idea is to be able to spin off some of the inventions and the creations that happen on campus, but bring them to communities so that communities can benefit. And of course, the university gets a little bit of a kickback, too, when that happens. So the nature of engagement has changed, but the general philosophy behind it, I don't think, has changed so much. It's really about building the economic vitality of the state is what our focus is. Now, today's institution, we have a predominant emphasis on what we call the STEM disciplines, science and technology and engineering and math. And so that's where we seem to be placing a lot of our emphasis today. Now, I'd be remiss if I did not talk about the community college system. We have a thriving community college system, a technical college system in New Hampshire, and in many ways, they're on the front lines. They're the ones that are providing the skills to the workforce that has recently been laid off from the lumber mills and from the paper plants. They're the ones that are making education accessible to the rural communities because they're actually located in the rural communities. In many ways, our community colleges are out-competing our land-grant university system. They're much more affordable. they're accessible, and they're really, they've done a better job of sort of switching to focus on what are the needs of the day, whereas the land-grant institutions are a little bit slower to make that transition, and we're still stuck a little bit. I wanted to talk briefly about a report that was conducted about 10 years ago by the Kellogg Foundation. And the Kellogg Foundation wrote this report called, I think it was called The Engaged Institution. And it was really not just public universities, but it was also private universities as well. And the major finding that came out of this report was that the institutions in the United States were largely perceived by the public as being out of touch and not connected to the needs of the day. So the recommendation of the Kellogg report was for the institutions to really place a stronger emphasis on the community, on focusing on the community benefit, and how could these institutions work with communities to help them to thrive. So I'm not sure if this is just perception, but perception is important, and we've seen that reflected in funding for our institutions. So going back to this typology of scholarship that I talked about briefly, that Ernest Boyer came up with. So we first have this what we call the scholarship of discovery, and that's basically generating new understanding about something. And that's an important function of the engaged institution today. The scholarship of integration. Integration is really about engaging your stakeholders, your public stakeholders, in the process of inquiry, so that you're not doing research independent of the public, you're doing research with the public sector, so that their needs are addressed at all stages in the process. The scholarship of application, and now that's largely what cooperative extension does, and that's taking the knowledge and the information that's generated on campus and bringing it out to the communities. And the scholarship of teaching, and that's using community as a backdrop for educating the public, whether it happens in the classroom or actually happens in communities. Now, I'm going to use this framework to frame much of my discussion. I'm going to talk about some of the University of New Hampshire's experiences with each of these types of scholarship, because I think each are important, but each are also very unique. So the scholarship of discovery. Now, I'm sure that when you think of discovery, you have images of Lewis and Clark that get conjured up in your mind, or famous scientists like Pasteur and Mendelssohn and Newton. But for me, the scholarship of discovery is something that may be much more mundane. It's about the everyday things that communities face. My own doctoral work was looking at community gardens in Boston, and I was very interested in how different ethnic groups in Boston practiced gardening in their community garden plots. And what I found was that the community garden plots, the physical manifestation of those plots, basically reflected the ethnic and demographic changes that were taking place in the communities. And you could almost see the demographic changes in neighborhoods in Boston before the census reflected them. You could see them in the community garden spaces. You saw a lot of the ethnic gardens that were gardened by Hispanics, Latinos, or African Americans from the South. Many of those people in Boston were getting squeezed out of their neighborhoods. They could no longer afford to live there, and so they're moving to other places. And as they moved away, a more affluent population came in to take their place. But as they did, the community gardens in those neighborhoods also changed to reflect the needs and the desires of that new population that was moving in. So I found it a very fascinating thing for me to sort of mark this transition of neighborhoods and look at it and how the physical spaces are changed. And for me, that exemplifies the scholarship of discovery. It's not a breakthrough science discovery, which many universities are focused on because that's where a lot of your grant money comes from, but it was certainly exciting for me. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about an example of discovery, the scholarship of discovery, how we have focused on it. As I mentioned, in New Hampshire, we have a pretty significant revenue gap that we're trying to close. We have about a $500 million revenue gap in a state of 1.3 million people. And there are only a limited number of ways that you can close that revenue gap. Well, we already know that taxation, increased taxes, is not something that Americans at this point in time from the U.S. are palatable to. We also have a liquor store. The state controls the sale of liquor in New Hampshire. So we generate millions and millions of dollars. It's one of our largest revenue sources by controlling the sale of liquor. We're not going to expand that. The state is actually thinking about selling off that operation to the private sector, so that'll generate some revenue to help to close the revenue gap. But increasingly, we're seeing a lot of discussion about expanding legalized gaming or gambling in New Hampshire. And it's certainly a polarized debate, let me put it that way, in New Hampshire. Now, there are a lot of large gambling operations that would very much like to move to New Hampshire. We have an amenable tax system. We have no income tax, so there are a lot of reasons why these large gaming operations would like to come. We have small-scale gambling, but we don't have any of the large casinos. And those casinos are really eyeing, particularly the southern part of the state that's within the commuting area of Boston, to locate a large casino. And this has created huge tensions politically and in communities. And there seems to be no middle ground. There aren't many people in New Hampshire that you would talk to that are ambivalent about gaming and gambling. You either want it badly because you see it as a revenue source, or there's no way in heck that you want it to come to the state because it's going to ruin the state character. So it's been a very polarizing debate in the Senate as well. Now, the governor of New Hampshire asked myself and a couple of colleagues of mine if we would be willing to sort of get a sense of New Hampshireites' attitudes towards legal gambling. And it sounded like a daunting challenge because I typically like to avoid contentious issues like this, and I knew it was going to be contentious, but for some reason we said yes to this offer. After all, it was the governor asking us, and we hoped that it would come with resources that would help our institution. So we decided that we would not do your typical poll or survey to find out what attitudes are, because that doesn't really give you a lot of depth or texture as to why people feel a certain way. So we decided that we would hold a series of deliberative sessions, deliberative discussions around the state to sort of really probe at people's attitudes towards expanding gambling. And so we had 11 sites that were picked out through the state, and at each of those sites we invited, from 50 to 100 people from the surrounding area to come and participate in a discussion. We gave them some information, some data that we were able to compile. We tried to keep that data as objective as we possibly could, just to give the participants some background. But the idea was to bring people together, to sort of have them check their positions at the door so that we could have a meaningful discussion about what people's concerns were and under what conditions they would like to see expanded gaming or not like to see expanded gaming. We wanted to probe that a little bit deeper. And we had some interesting discussions. In one particular community, we had a discussion in a town that already had a racetrack, and they had gaming in the community. And so what we found, there was a large gaming contingent in that community, and they rallied, and they made sure that all 50 or 60 people who were part of this coalition to support gaming turned out at this event. And we kind of knew this was going to happen at this event, so we did our best to make sure that other people who reflected other positions and other attitudes were also at the table. And what we ended up finding was that there was a wonderful discussion in this community. Even though the pro-gaming people probably outnumbered the anti-gaming people, there was a lot of exchange of ideas. And when those people that came into the door of this discussion left this discussion, at the end of the day, it was a full day of deliberation, they actually had more questions than answers. And they decided that, we need some things answered before we can fully support this position. So it was a very productive dialogue in that sense, to get people to sort of think more deeply about their convictions and what it means to them. This is a picture of some of us holding little small focus group discussions at that gaming discussion. Other communities in the northern part of the state, as I mentioned, it's very forested. Tourism is the largest revenue source, and surprisingly, people in the northern part of the state we would have expected would want expanded gambling. But surprisingly, they were more concerned about the rural character of their communities, and they were more opposed to seeing gaming coming in to the community than those in the southern part of the state. So just to highlight some of the findings from that discussion, some of our key findings were, one, it's really more important to consider how to go about expanding gaming than whether or not to expand. It's really the nuance behind people's ideas and positions that's important. And we really delved into this. The participants throughout all of these 11 sites where we had these discussions really kind of agreed on 3 central tenets. That if gaming was to occur, whether you were for it or against it, 3 tenets needed to be met. First, it's important that gaming be able to maintain good jobs in the community. Second, we have to maintain the quality of life. It can't erode away at the quality of life if we're to accept it. And it has to contribute to a vital economy, which really has to do with where do the benefits come to. When you think about most casinos, they're usually sort of a national corporation that comes into a state, and much of the revenue that comes to a casino leaves the state. So New Hampshireites were very concerned about how this revenue was apportioned, and they wanted to make sure that some of this money came back to the state. And last, we discovered, as I mentioned in this case where the people from this town of Salem came together, very strong opposition to gaming, there's a lot that's nuanced behind people's viewpoints. Some people came to this discussion very opposed to gaming, but then they found out, well, one, much of the revenue could leave the state, and two, that the state government would have a heavy role in regulating gaming. And so they changed their mind, and they said, under those conditions, we don't want to see gaming coming to our state. So all of this wrapped up, we compiled a report that we gave to the governor and to the state legislature. The governor wanted to get a sense of how the public felt. And so as a result of this report, which outlined some of our findings, which one of the findings, people had more questions after the result of this forum that needed to be answered before we were to move forward. The governor said that he would veto any bill that came across his desk that was in favor of expanding gaming until some of these questions were answered. So to this day, we have not authorized expanded gaming in New Hampshire. It's not to say that we won't. We may in the near future, but I think this deliberative discussion really informed the debate and the discussion in the state. So I want to talk about another case about integration. Now, I want to point out that integration is really about, as I mentioned before, it's engaging your stakeholders, it's engaging your students, your public, your communities in the process of inquiry at all stages in the process. So when we talk about collaborative science, for instance, where we have an issue such as pollution, etc., the important thing about integrated science is to connect with your stakeholders as you're framing your research problem. It's important that you get a public view of what the problems are, get their perceptions about it. You engage the public in sort of helping to craft the research questions that you're asking. Also, with integrated science, it's important that the public be part of the actual research process. When we do integrated science in New Hampshire, we actually engage the stakeholders of communities in the process. We have, I'll talk about a process in a minute, of we're actually engaging the residents and the public in doing collaborative science. They're actually out there collecting the data and helping us do the testing. And I think the most important thing about integration is that once the science and the findings and the results come in, it's important that that be shared back again with the community and that the scientists work with community decision makers to make sure that that information leads to good decision making. So that's what I mean when I talk about integrated science or integration. It's important that you engage the public stakeholders at all stages in the process. Now, this here is a picture of Great Bay. It's a large estuarine system in New Hampshire. It's about 24 square miles. I guess that would be about 40 square kilometers of space. It's one of the largest estuarine systems in the United States. The water, the tide comes in and out 2 times a day, so basically this whole estuary gets flushed twice a day. And it's a very beautiful system. It's experiencing a lot of population growth in this estuary. And as a result of this population growth, we're starting to run into some problems. There are 44 towns that live in this estuary. And about 20 of these towns have sewage treatment plants that dump directly into the estuary. And as you can imagine, that results in some large problems. We have loading of phosphorus and loading of nitrogen into the bay, and that's impacting the natural system to a great degree. We've seen, as you have more nitrogen coming into the bay, it depletes the oxygen, and it can result in algal blooms. You see die-offs of certain species of fish. We see our eelgrass, which is vital to our habitat, starting to die off. And so we're starting to see all of these negative ecosystem effects that are coming from all of this nitrogen released into the bay. Now, I want to point out that sewage treatment plants are not the largest source. Even though we have 22 sewage treatment plants dumping into the bay, they only account for about 30% of the nitrogen that's actually reaching the bay. The rest of the nitrogen comes from non-point sources. It comes from agricultural runoff. It comes from we actually discovered that a lot of this nitrogen is coming from airborne. It's coming from pollution that's coming from the Ohio Valley that's getting deposited into the bay. And so this is creating a huge problem. Now, recently, the EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency, which is the body that's in charge of regulating environmental issues and air quality issues in the United States, they designated Great Bay, or these portions in red, as impaired, which means that they can no longer sustain vital life. And what that also means is that by federal law, the communities around Great Bay have to actually legally act to do something to reduce nitrogen. So we've been charged just 6 months ago with reducing our nitrogen inputs by 50%. Now, 50% is a lot to reduce them by. So I think we're challenged by that. Even if you shut off all of the sewage treatment plants in the whole estuary, all 22 of them, and had them stop emitting sewage into the bay that's been treated, even that wouldn't get us close enough to the number that we need to reach. So we need to find other ways to reduce nitrogen, whether it's lawn fertilizer, pesticides. It's going to be a challenge to reach that number. So we lobbied the Environmental Protection Agency to have a little bit of local control in the way that we solve this problem. So the EPA said, okay, we could issue some mandates. We could tell your sewage treatment plants that they have to cut nitrogen by 75%. We could do this and we could do that. But we're going to give you a little bit of local control so that communities in the region can decide collectively how they want to address this problem of nitrogen loading. So an alliance was formed with all 44 towns involved in this alliance called the Southeast Watershed Alliance. The acronym is SUWA, which is ironic because SUWA is one of the major contributors of pollution. And so our role, we got a grant from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration to work with SUWA, forgive the acronym, and our work is to basically to help them to identify some of the issues that are at hand. And so we got a grant to do this project to identify, the first thing that they need to know is where is this nitrogen coming from? If only 30% of it's coming from sewage treatment plants, where is the rest coming from? So our grant is going to enable us to do some testing. We placed about 300 or 400 sensors out into Great Bay that are collecting water samples over time. So we collect multiple samples throughout the year. And we're going to take these samples, not me, because I'm not a scientist, I'm a social scientist. My colleagues are going to take these samples back to the lab, and they're going to start to use some isotopic tests to determine where are those nitrogen sources coming from. These tests are pretty sophisticated. We can actually determine if it's human waste, animal waste. We can even get down to what kind of species contributed to that nitrogen. We can identify the signature of different types of fertilizers that are being used, whether it's agricultural fertilizer or lawn fertilizer. And so we're going to have a really good geographic picture of what the sources of nitrogen look like that are coming into the bay. So hopefully this will give us better ammunition to be able to target the problem and to be able to target where these sources are coming from. So this is a map. This depicts all of the sites across the Great Bay Estuary, the 24 square miles, where we're testing. The red sites depict sites where far too much nitrogen is being inputted into the bay, and where the levels of nitrogen far exceed the federal limits. And so what we're really concerned about is, in those spots that are red, what is the source of nitrogen? Because if you don't know the source of nitrogen, it's pretty difficult to begin to target that. Now, we're only in the analysis stage of the process. We actually have community partners, as well as watershed coalitions and various citizen science groups that are actually out there helping us to collect this data. And so it's been an exciting process. And what we found is, when we engage the public, they suddenly bring new things to the table. They have new questions that really influence our science. One thing that we never considered was, what effect do buffers have? Buffers being a vegetative buffer. When you have vegetation separating, say, a lawn and the water, what effect do buffers have on nitrogen loading into Great Bay? And they asked us to start looking at some towns that do have buffers, using zoning ordinances to create a mandatory buffer, and comparing that with towns that do not have buffers to see if there's any difference in how much nitrogen is actually coming into the bay. And what we think we're going to find is that those towns that do have buffers, they can really eliminate a lot of the nitrogen coming into the bay. And so maybe that's a solution. It's a lot less costly than upgrading your sewage treatment plant to create a vegetative buffer than it is to implement a new technology in a sewage. What we found out, too, if sewage treatment plants indeed are the big target for how we get to reducing nitrogen, it could cost individual towns $10 million to upgrade their sewage treatment plants. $10 million, and multiply that by 22 towns. That's a lot of money that people in New Hampshire communities don't particularly want to spend. There's no doubt that they're going to have to do something to reduce their nitrogen loads, but if we can find other ways to do that, then it helps. So, I want to switch gears again, and I want to talk about the scholarship of application. As I said, that's largely what cooperative extension does. It's bringing science-based information and education and bringing that out to the communities so that our work at the university has bearing on the public good. One of the programs that falls under my shop is called Community Profiles. And Community Profiles, I know we talked about it a little bit last night. It's a visioning program. And the idea is that a community profile refers to a 2-day event where community residents come together in a forum-type environment, and they start to discuss where they've been historically, what have been some of the challenges, what are the things that their community has faced in the past. They talk about what is the community like today. Then they start to craft a vision for what they would like their community to look like 10 or 20 years down the line. And as a result of this visioning exercise, the community begins to break up into small working groups. And these working groups are really focusing on targeting elements that can be moved forward with their vision. So action committees actually result from this process. So you have a series in a community that conducts this community profile visioning process. You might have 4 or 5 action committees focused on particular projects that are aimed at moving this vision forward. And I'm sure that a lot of places do a similar exercise such as this. Now, the University of New Hampshire Cooperative Extension's role in this is really to help to facilitate this dialogue. It's to sort of bring some of the capacity building to communities so that they can implement this process. It takes 6, 8, 9 months of planning just to be able to do this community visioning forum. We ask that the community bring together a diverse group of leaders from the communities to plan and steer this process. Not just the formal leaders, not just the municipal leaders. We ask that people from the clergy, we ask people from underrepresented audiences. We ask that a diversity of people come together to steer this process. We provide some training in facilitation. We ask that community members actually do some of the facilitation at this 2-day event. And it's proven to be a great capacity tool because once we leave as cooperative extension, well, now you have a trained cohort of 10 or 12 people from the community that are experienced in facilitation and can help with discussions and dialogue and move those forward in the community. We also work with the community to market the event and to get people to come out to it. So there's a lot of work that comes on the front end of this process just to make it happen and to ensure that you get a good cohort of the community out to this event. Now, We have done this process in, I think, about 45 towns in the state of New Hampshire. And to this date, we have some towns where this community visioning forum, it might be a town of 500 people, you might only get 30 people to come out to this forum. But nonetheless, it can have some very profound impacts for this community. And other communities, we had one community in a town called Jackson, New Hampshire, which is largely a retirement community, but almost 50% of the town showed up for this community profile forum. So imagine having a room packed filled with 700 people in a town of 1,400 people. That's unheard of in public deliberation. It made our job of facilitation a little bit more challenging, but it was unbelievable to see the community spirit and the engagement that came out of this town. Now, my role is not only to help to build community's capacity to implement this process and to be a large group facilitator in this process, but I also want to get a sense of what the long-term outcomes of this community visioning process are. So we've been keeping a record for the past 10 years. We do a number of surveys, we've interviewed people, and we've sort of kept track of what the communities say they want to achieve to see how they actually gain traction on each of those elements over time. And what we found is that this came through a survey. When we asked people 1 to 2 years after the community profile, what was the most important outcome of that community profile for you? We expected them to see, sort of to identify some of the bricks and mortar items. We built a community center, or we generated new jobs or something. But what we actually found out, it was largely the intangible items that became more important to the community in the longer term. Improved communications in the community was the most identified outcome, the most important outcome identified by over 80% of the respondents identified that as a key factor. And improved communications could be anything from a newsletter to simply having greater opportunities for people in the community to network. Greater civic participation in the community was also something that resulted from this community profile. We have several towns that this community profile had really been the only opportunity for community residents to come together and share with each other what some of the issues were in the community. And they, since the community profile event, they've actually continued this tradition of bringing people together for civic dialogue. Enhanced sense of community is another outcome. And of course, this is more of a tangible outcome, but particularly in southern New Hampshire, where we're losing a lot of our agricultural lands and our forest, conservation and preservation of natural resources was an important outcome. But for me, what I found was most interesting was that people really sort of identified more strongly with the intangible outcomes. But these intangible outcomes, such as built leadership capacity, greater sense of community, they often, I call it spiraling up, and led to some more tangible outcomes. They used the capacities that they gained to, in the future, not necessarily directly as a result of the community profile, but they leveraged that new capacity to do physical things down the line, whether it was to build something or what have you. I want to talk to you a little bit about one particular town, this town called Landaff. This town is in a really hilly portion of New Hampshire. It's a town of about 300 people. It's a very small town. When people came to the community profile, they really complained that even though they're from a small town, that there was really no way of finding out what was happening in the town. And so people felt very disconnected from each other, and they felt disconnected from municipal government. And so one of the biggest outcomes that resulted from this process was that they decided that they wanted to create their own newsletter. And this newsletter, this started in, I think, 2005, but they do, I think they do it monthly now. But they do this monthly newsletter, and it's continued for 6 years. And what we found in the community, that people incredibly value this newsletter. It's resulted in new things happening, in new opportunities, new events being scheduled, and more people becoming involved in municipal government. What we found, the planning board is an example. I'm not sure if you have planning boards here in communities, but the planning board is basically in charge of sort of creating the master plan, the vision for how land is to be used in the future, but also setting up the regulatory structure for how to regulate land use. And what we found out that prior to this community profile, there were only 2 people on the planning board. Nobody wanted to participate in it. But as they started to share information and put out the call for support and help through this newsletter called the Jockey Hill Journal, Jockey Hill is the one hill in the town. All of a sudden, new blood came out, and the planning board went from 2 people to about 12 people, and they actually had to turn people away. So what I'm trying to get at is this one idea of enhancing communication in the community all of a sudden resulted in all of these different offshoots that benefited the community. This is the town of Jackson that I mentioned a minute ago, where we had about half the community come out to this community profile. What we didn't know when we got into this community profile process was that there was a lot of dissent and there was a lot of unhappiness in the community. People were very disappointed with the municipal boards, the municipal governance. They felt that it was not very transparent. They felt that municipal decision makers were making decisions that did not reflect the community's will. And there were very few opportunities for people to come together and talk. So one of the outcomes of this community profile, we trained facilitators and we trained group leaders in this process. And out of the group leaders that we trained, 6 of them actually decided they had never had any leadership experience in the community before. 6 of them went on to take roles within municipal government. They became members of the planning board or the select board, which is the main municipal decision-making body. And they basically ousted the non-transparent people in this community were forced out. And so you got new blood, and they started instituting new mechanisms to engage the public in decision-making. So that's another indirect outcome of this community profile process that sort of brought this concept of bringing people together, and it cultivated it in the community so people began to see the value of that. New Boston is another town where they had no formal way of celebrating their town's heritage. And as a result of this community profile, people loved this opportunity. We kicked it off with a potluck dinner. People each brought their own food to this dinner, and they decided that this was such a fun experience that they needed to cultivate more ways for the community to come together. So now they implement 2 summer festivals. One is an Old Home Day, which is sort of a heritage festival of the community, and then there's another festival that they hold each year. And the committee that orchestrated these 2 events was a direct result of this community profile event. And lastly, the town of Brentwood, New Hampshire. Brentwood is located in the southern tier of New Hampshire. It's actually on Great Bay, the bay that I talked about a little while ago. And they're experiencing rapid growth. The population of Brentwood has more than doubled in the last 20 years. And they're seeing their remaining agricultural land and their little tracts of forest disappear very quickly. So one of the things that came through strongly at the Brentwood community profile is they really wanted to come together to be able to preserve the natural and agricultural attributes of the community that they loved. And that was the reason why many of them moved to this community. So one of the action committees that resulted from this decided that they wanted to form to figure out how to put new lands into conservation. And knowing how much land costs in southern New Hampshire, I was a little skeptical because I thought it was going to be a real big challenge for a committee of citizen volunteers to come together and generate funding and support to put land into conservation, both agricultural easement and natural resource easement. But I'm proud to say that we conducted this community profile 10 years ago. They've put about 1,500 acres into permanent conservation, which is a huge outcome for this community, and it's part of their pride, and they use it in their little town moniker. That's one of the things that they emphasize when they brag about themselves to other communities. So those are just some examples of some of the outcomes that we've had. I want to talk now about the scholarship of teaching. I was going to show a video, but I don't think we have the technology to be able to do that, so I can just talk about it. About 10 years ago, the University of New Hampshire, we had a forward-thinking provost, who was second to the president, who decided that the University of New Hampshire needed to be more engaged in the way that it does scholarship. And so she developed what was called the Outreach Scholars Academy. And we kind of all rolled our eyes when she created this concept. But she would select people from all around the college, or all around the university, from different colleges and different programs, and she would bring them together for a learning experience. And we would learn about different ways that we can engage communities in our own research. And part of this process was that each of these cohorts, these learning groups, had to develop a project that somehow involved community stakeholders in this process. And we thought that this program was going to fizzle out. The first year, I was in the first class of Engaged Scholars. There wasn't a whole lot of interest. It wasn't very well organized. But over time, this program just got better and better. And all of a sudden, it became the in thing to do. Everybody wanted to be part of the Engaged Scholars Academy, and everybody was applying to do it, but they had to turn people away because there was so much interest in it. Then the deans and the higher administration became intrigued by this process. So what this program did was to elevate the status of engaged scholarship in the university system through a formal program. And now it's actually been reflected in our promotion and tenure process. Prior to this program, if you wanted to get promoted to associate professor, you needed to publish in these esoteric journals that maybe 12 people around the world read. But now, if you publish a guide, a good forestry guide, or something that's more focused to a trade journal or to a community, that also counts as part of your publication. So for me, this is profound. This is a major transformational change that has taken place at the University of New Hampshire, which is recalibrating what scholarship means. It's not just about breakthrough discovery. It's also about things that have practical application, may not end up in a journal, but they're actually used by communities around the state. So I think this program has been very instrumental in changing our philosophy at the University of New Hampshire. So briefly talk about some of the challenges. We have struggled. This provost has since moved on, and so now it's a tough and heavy task to educate the new administrators that have taken over about the value and the importance of engaged scholarship. So we find that we're constantly having to raise this issue with our administration so that we keep engaged scholarship, scholarship that has benefit to the public good and engages the public on the radar and on the front burner. Now, a lot of faculty don't want to take a risk. Many faculty, we find, are used to sitting in their office, in their little cubicle, closing their doors, and doing their science independently. So many of them, when they say, oh, you want me to engage communities in my scholarship, well, how am I going to do that? It's a big risk that they have to take. So sometimes it takes a little prodding to get some of the faculty to participate in this program. But invariably, when we do, we see these great results. We've had a lot. I'll talk a little bit about some of the outcomes that have resulted from that. Cultivating community partnerships. I think many people had a misconception is that if you want to do engaged scholarship, you just go out to the community and say, hey, listen, I want to do this project, and that it's easy. People are just going to jump right on board and start working with you. Well, cultivating partnerships, as you all know, takes a long, long time. And it can take years to develop a partnership. I think in communities that surround the University of New Hampshire, there's a sense of distrust towards university faculty. People don't know exactly what we do. They think that we get a lot of money to do this esoteric research that never sees the light of day. So it's only natural that there is some semblance of distrust that comes from communities when we go out and say that we want to partner with them. So it takes a lot of relationship building to be able to work effectively with communities. Finding resources is a bit of a challenge as well. I'm happy to say that some of our major institutions in the United States, funding institutions like NASA, the National Space Administration, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, are all of a sudden, in the last year, they're actually mandating that their grants require an integration component. They're mandating that you have to engage the public in your grant project, whether it's science or what have you, in the process in order to get funding. It has to be a major component of it. So that has made it a lot easier to be able to get funding. But nonetheless, in a time when we're seeing less federal funding and less state funding being targeted towards our educational institutions, and we have this thing called earmarks. And earmarks are when Congress has the ability to direct money towards programs that are not necessarily a year-by-year program, but they're for states can advocate for this type of money. Those are disappearing. And people really lambaste earmarks, but they actually have funded some really good science. But those are disappearing, so we're a little bit worried about the ability to conduct really innovative science with the loss of these earmarks. So we need to figure out how to
develop new funding sources, and maybe it's through private partnerships. And evaluating our work is always a challenge. I spoke with several of you last night about some of the work that you're doing evaluating community impacts. I think there's a lot that I can learn from you on how to do that, as well as some of the findings that you have, and perhaps we can share some ideas about evaluating community work. I talked about this. So, a couple of quick lessons that I'll just recap on. Start with the need in mind. If you're doing engaged scholarship, it should be focused on something, at least in my perception, something that has benefit to the public good. It should be something that's driven largely by stakeholder needs. You need to be organized. When I talked about this expansion of gambling, public deliberation that we conducted, we only had 5 weeks to be able to pull this off. When the governor told us that he needed our help, we were expecting him to say, well, by next year you can conduct this process. But we had 5 weeks. And in order to do that, 5 weeks is really too short to be able to pull something off of that magnitude, as we learned later. But you need to be organized. Integrate with stakeholders at all stages of the process. And when I say stakeholders, it could be private industry, it could be communities, etc. You need to pull them in on the front end, before your research questions and before the outcomes are defined. And lastly, you need to coordinate with other institutions. We do, frankly, and I'll be honest here, we do a horrible job at the University of New Hampshire about collaborating with community colleges and other universities and other institutions. We do a terrible job because it's partly as a result of our administrative structure. It's almost impossible to split a grant between two institutions because one of the institutions has to get all of the overhead. So we rarely collaborate in that way. And there are some of us that are trying to foster new collaborations, but we keep running into administrative barriers to being able to do that. And so we need to find a way to tear down some of those barriers. So here's a little cartoon that I pulled. California State University and prison. Well, that's one way to avoid budget cuts. Well, the message here is not to turn our university systems into prisons, but we have to be able to think creatively about how to engage the public and how to bring resources to bear on the public good.